Psychological experiments may increase the sum of knowledge on human behavior and can be useful to understand what makes people tick. However, the methods that a number of psychologists have used in order to test their theories have at times overstepped ethical boundaries or might even appear somewhat sadistic. Those taking part in such studies have not always escaped unscathed either. In fact, as a result, some have suffered lasting emotional damage or worse. Experiments with people suffering from schizophrenia, with children who will suffer from disorders for the rest of their lives, or experiments with macaque monkeys hooked on illegal substances, these are 7 bizarre psychology experiments that completely cross the line. Number 7. Milgram Experiment, 1961. If an authority figure ordered you to deliver more than 400-volt electrical shock to another person, would you follow orders? Most people would answer with an adamant no. However, the Milgram obedience experiment aimed to prove otherwise. Yale University social psychology professor Stanley Milgram embarked on his infamous series of obedience experiments in 1961. Shortly after, the trial of the World War II criminal Adolf Eichmann had begun, and it led to some surprising results. They offered a compelling and disturbing look at the power of authority and obedience. The participants were 40 men recruited by using newspaper ads. In exchange for their participation, each person was given $4.50. For each test, Milgram lined up 3 people who were split into the roles of experimenter, or authority figure, teacher, the volunteer, and learner, actually an actor. After that, the teacher, who was separated from the learner and told to comply with the experiment, would attempt to tutor the learner in sets of word pairs. The penalty for wrong answers by the learner was shocking in more ways than one, as they pretended to receive painful and increasingly strong jolts of electricity that the teacher thought they were delivering. Of the 40 participants in the study, 26 delivered the maximum shocks, while 14 stopped before reaching the highest levels. All of them were debriefed at the end of the experiment, and researchers explained the procedures and the use of deception. The research suggested that situational variables have a stronger sway than personality factors in determining obedience. However, other psychologists argue that both external and internal factors heavily influence obedience, such as personal belief and overall temperament. Number 6. Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971. In August 1971, Stanford University psychology professor Philip Zimbardo decided to carry out an experiment very similar to that of Milgram. He wanted to test the theory that brutality reported among guards in American prisons was due to the sadistic personalities of the guards or had more to do with the prison environment. Zimbardo and his team set up a simulated prison in the Stanford Psychology building and gave 24 volunteers the roles of either prisoner or guard. The participants did not know each other prior to the study and were paid $15 per day to take part in the experiment. The participants were then dressed according to their assigned roles, with Zimbardo handing himself the part of superintendent. What happened was pretty disturbing. Around 4 of the dozen guards became actively sadistic and violent, to the point that one of the false prisoners was shut in a cupboard. Zimbardo himself was so immersed in his role that he didn't notice the severity of what was going on. According to Zimbardo, the Stanford prison experiment revealed how people will readily conform to the social roles they are expected to play, especially if the roles are as strongly stereotyped as those of prison guards. Because the guards were placed in a position of authority, they began to act in ways they would not usually behave in their normal lives. Number 5. The Third Wave Experiment, 1967. How was the Holocaust allowed to happen? It is one of history's burning questions. Ron Jones, a teacher at Palo Alto's Cooberly High School, California, was struggling to answer it for his sophomore students in 1967. Deciding that the best way to teach students how easily people can be swayed by fearsome leaders or swept up by ideology was to demonstrate it. On the first day of his experiment, Jones created an authoritarian atmosphere in his class, positioning himself as a sort of supreme leader. The first few days, the third wave was a game. We had lots of rules, we had lots of things we had to do, recalls one of Jones' former students in the 2011 documentary Lesson Plan, The Story of the Third Wave. But as the weeks progressed, Jones' one-man brand of fascism turned into a school-wide club. Students came up with their own insignia and adopted a Nazi-style salute. They were taught to firmly obey Jones' commands and become anti-democratic to the core. Jones' new ideology, dubbed the Third Wave, spread like wildfire. By just the fourth day, Jones felt he was losing control over the experiment. It had attracted the attention of the students and the movement had grown. There was even an active resistance to it. Jones decided it had to end. After a few minutes of near-silent squirming, Jones revealed to the students that they'd been part of an experiment in planting the seeds of fascism. He ended the meeting by playing a film about Nazism. Number 4. UCLA Schizophrenia Medication Experiment, 1983 to 1994. From 1983, psychologist Keith H. Nuchtherlein and psychiatrist Michael Gitlin from the UCLA Medical Center commenced a controversial study into the mental processes of schizophrenia. Specifically, they were trying to find out if some schizophrenics might do better without medication. To achieve this, they counted on 50 schizophrenics from a group of hundreds involved in the program, to whom their medication was taken off. 23 of 50 patients under treatment for schizophrenia suffered severe relapses, hallucinations, and paranoia. Nevertheless, the experiment has been criticized for not sufficiently protecting the patients in the event of schizophrenic symptoms returning. Nor did it clearly determine the point at which the patients should be treated again. What is more, this had tragic consequences. Families of 2 of the patients filed complaints about the experiment with the federal government. One patient, Antonio La Madrid, a student, killed himself in 1991 by jumping from 9 floors up, despite having been supposedly under the study's watch. The other, Gregory Aller, dropped out of college and threatened to kill his parents. Several ethicists said that the university's experiment was improper because those directing it did not tell patients enough about the risks. Some of the ethicists also said the experiment was probably unethical even if proper consent had been given, because it was expected that many of the patients would suffer severe mental relapses. Number 3. The Monster Study, 1939. The Monster Study was a stuttering experiment performed on 22 orphan children in Davenport, Iowa in 1939. It was conducted by Wendell Johnson at the University of Iowa. Graduate student Mary Tudor conducted the experiment under Johnson's supervision. It was dubbed the Monster Study, as some of Johnson's colleagues were horrified that he would experiment on orphan children to confirm a hypothesis. Many of the normal-speaking orphan children who received negative therapy in the experiment suffered negative psychological effects, and some retained speech problems for the rest of their lives. In fact, in 2007, half a dozen of the former subjects were given a large payout by the state of Iowa for what they had endured. The University of Iowa publicly apologized for the Monster Study. However, Patricia Zebrowski, University of Iowa Assistant Professor of Speech Pathology and Audiology, notes that the data that resulted from the experiment is the largest collection of scientific information on the phenomenon of stuttering, and that Johnson's work was the first to discuss the importance of the stutterer's thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, and feelings, and continues to influence views on stuttering greatly. Number 2. Women with Scars on Their Faces, 1991. In 1993, Brenda Major, social psychologist and distinguished professor at the University of California, and Jennifer Crooker, professional researcher and Ohio eminent scholar in social psychology at Ohio State University, conducted an experiment in which researchers fashioned a scar on female subjects using theatrical makeup before their interaction with a stranger hired for the experiment. The women were given a mirror to see the results, but unbeknown to them, the scar was removed before the face-to-face conversation with the stranger. After the meeting, the women were asked how did they feel, and although none of them had visible blemishes on their faces, after all, the scars had already been removed, many talked about being subjected to some form of discrimination by the other person, and were even able to tell exactly what words and actions the interlocutor used for the purpose of insulting. In this case, no real reason was needed. The women simply knew that they belonged to a discriminated group, and that was enough to make them feel like victims of discrimination. Number 1. Monkey Drug Trials, 1969. While their findings may have shed light on the psychological aspects of drug addiction, 3 researchers at the University of Michigan Medical School arguably completely overstepped the mark in 1969 by getting macaque monkeys hooked on illegal substances. G.A. Deneau, T. Yanagita, and M.H. Sievers injected the unwitting primates with drugs, including cocaine, amphetamines, morphine, and alcohol. Why? In order to see if the animals would go on to freely administer doses of the psychoactive and, in some cases, potentially deadly substances themselves. Many of the monkeys did, which the researchers claimed established a link between drug abuse and psychological dependence. Still, given the fact that the conclusions cannot necessarily be applied to humans, the experiment may have had questionable scientific value. Moreover, even if a link was determined, the method was quite possibly unethical and undoubtedly cruel, especially since some of the monkeys became a danger to themselves and died. Psychological experiments can be key to understanding what makes people tick, but sometimes neither researchers nor investigations can't explain some weird event occurred in our planet. For example, the unsolved bus in Vancouver whose passengers got sick at the same time. Would you like to know more about this story? If so, check out this video.